Congo. For those of you that I've not told about this yet, when I was 10 years old, I spent a year in Tanzania with my family, which is just across the lake from Congo. And at the time, there was a population of Congolese refugees who had resettled in Tanzania because of conflict that I wasn't aware of at the time. But as I got older, I started doing a little bit more research, and the history of the Congo is one that's, how do I say this delicately, nauseating, but it's also, I think, really important to pay attention to because it covers some events that are often overlooked when we talk about world history. And by the end of this presentation, you'll probably draw your own conclusions about why that is. But I'm going to start where I love to always start, with a little bit of context.
Yes.
So right smack in the middle of Africa is a country that today we call the Democratic Republic of Congo, formerly Zaire, and formerly the Belgian Congo. It's pretty big. In terms of landmass, it's about 4 times the size of Germany, so about 3 times the size of Texas. And it's got a population today that's about 120 million people, so it's comparable to Mexico. This is one of the richest countries in terms of natural resources on Earth. They have huge reserves of the following resources: ivory, gold, copper, oil, cobalt, uranium, diamonds, coffee, coltan, tantalum, timber, and rubber. Not to mention, it also has a river that's capable of producing enough hydroelectric power to power the entire continent of Africa. And if you didn't know anything about Congo's history, you would probably assume that because of these natural resources and because of its powerful river, this would make Congo a very wealthy, prosperous nation. Unfortunately, that is not the case. The DRC regularly ranks among the lowest in the United Nations Human Development Index, and its people are among the poorest on Earth. And through examining its history today, I want to answer one particular question: why? Why is that? Why is it that in spite of all this wealth you can find in this very large country, why are its people subjected to abject poverty? Well, a lot of that is due to the legacy of a single person who never even went to the Congo during his life. He never traveled there. He was Leopold II of Belgium. Leopold II became King of Belgium in 1865, and his kingdom is not a whole lot larger than the state of New Hampshire, but it was sandwiched on all sides by very powerful countries. The old world power of France, at the time a newly unified Germany, and across the English Channel, his cousin ruled over Great Britain, the most powerful empire in the world at the time. As his neighbors were carving up colonies of their own all over the world, Leopold wanted in on that. He wanted a colony of his own for Belgium in order to help build Belgium into a wealthy, prosperous country akin to France. He wanted Brussels to be a large, sophisticated metropolitan area, Paris. He saw Africa as a tremendous opportunity. And what really captured his attention was the expedition of Henry Morton Stanley across the Congo River between 1874 and 1877. And I'll show a map of that in just a few seconds. But Stanley, who was born in Wales, spent much of his formative years in New Orleans, and then eventually most of his exploration career in sub-Saharan Africa, was the first white person to cross Africa overland via the Congo River. And after he returned in the late 1870s, Leopold employed him as an agent, if you will, to travel to the interior of the Congo Basin, the main region within the Congo River area in Central Africa, and establish an infrastructure to extract resources. And this would be the precursor to a railway line that I'll show you a map of a little bit later. And so after that, Stanley agreed to a 5-year contract, which gave him a salary the equivalent of $250,000 in today's money, and he proceeded to establish posts up and down the Congo River. So here's a map the same map. And I don't know if you can see, but this right here is the mouth of the Congo River. There's a town here called Banana, hilariously enough. There's another town called Kitome, which is right on the coast. But the river kind of runs up the border here and to what today is called Kinshasa, the capital, right on the banks of the Congo River, right across the river from the capital of the Republic of Congo. And as you go further up the river, it's a very navigable river, you go up to the town of Mbandaka, and further up to what at the time was referred to as Stanley Falls. I can't remember what it's called now. The name has been changed. To the Stanley's west or easternmost trading port along the Congo River, which was called Stanleyville. It's since been changed to Kisangani. And you can see there's also all these other towns that have been established along the tributaries of the Congo River and throughout the basin. But if you look at a map of the transportation structure of Congo, it hasn't changed since Belgian rule. It hasn't changed at all since the Belgians built it. Everything in the Congo, when it comes to transportation, is set up to ship out commodities. So everything is designed to extract, we'll talk more about the resources a little later, from within the interior and get it on boats and railways along the Congo River and then out from the port of Banana and Kitome on the coast. It's not designed to turn the Congo into a first-rate industrial power. The infrastructure in the Congo is very much designed for a colony and not a nation-state. And I hope that paints a little bit of a picture. While Stanley was building Leopold's colony in the Congo, in his employ, Leopold needed to legitimize his claim to the Congo to wealthy European benefactors, other royal families, investors. And so he hosted benefit causes and philanthropic events to sell the idea that his claim to the Belgian Congo was a philanthropic, scientific endeavor. He sold Europe's Europe's politicians and elites that on the idea that his claim to the Congo was a humanitarian effort to stamp out the slave trade and to establish a civilization in Central Africa. But the two that really bought his pitch were actually two American politicians. Henry Shelton Stanford, who was at the time the former ambassador to Belgium, and John Tyler Morgan, who was a U.S. senator. I can't remember exactly what state he came from. But anyways, they bought his pitch and they convinced one of our more forgettable presidents to formally recognize Leopold's claim to the Belgian Congo in 1882. After the United States recognized Belgium's claim, that then caused the rest of Leopold's European neighbors, France, Britain, Germany, Portugal, to do the same. And so, in 1884, the European powers met in Berlin and divided up Africa into each of their colonial spheres. And I'll talk more about this map in just a few seconds. But Leopold got everything that he wanted. He got the entirety of what today is the DRC, and he named his colony the Congo Free State. No Africans were present at this meeting, and none were consulted at all. So this is a map of Africa circa 1914. The borders at that time hadn't really changed much since the Berlin Conference. But as you can see, this area in yellow became the Congo Free State, later the Belgian Congo. The border hasn't really changed much at all since then as well. All this land that's shaded in blue, sorry, not this one. All this land that's shaded in blue was French land. In red, it was British. In dark green, those were claimed by the Portuguese. In light green, they were claimed by Germany. So what today is Namibia, Tanzania, Cameroon, and Togo. And if all the land that's in orange, like a dark orange, was claimed by Italy. So Libya, Eritrea, and what at the time was referred to as Italian Somaliland. Today it's part of Somalia. So what happened after Leopold got his colony in the Congo? Well, how do I put this delicately too? Can someone help me think of a good term for plunder and slaughter? Okay, fair enough. So Leopold II essentially owned Congo as his private estate from 1884 until he was forced to sell it to the Belgian government in 1906. And while he was the Belgians legitimized their control by sending their government agents, including Stanley, into the Congo River Basin and to negotiate with chiefs. And they would make treaties with the chiefs in exchange for rights to mining, timber, agriculture, game, essentially pretty much everything in their territory. But the chiefs, you have to remember that at the time, the indigenous Africans these people didn't have a written language, and they didn't have a concept of a legal contract. And Stanley and the Belgians were well aware of this. So they essentially said, here, just draw an X right there. You don't know what the rest of this writing on this contract means, but just draw an X right there, and we'll give you gin and beads and some cloth. So, yeah, that happened. And after his solidification of control, the Belgians established a private army for Leopold, which was called the Force Publique. By 1900, there were 19,000 professionals within the Force Publique, and Leopold and his agents used particularly brutal methods to enslave the Congolese tribes. Initially, at the beginning of the Congo Free State era, the Africans would have been, the word recruiting is doing a lot of heavy lifting here. They would have been forced into labor as ivory hunters and porters, and then later as rubber harvesters. Rubber harvesting, so rubber is a sap that comes from a vine that are very common throughout jungles in Central Africa. And the way that you extract rubber is you have to make a cut into the vine and essentially squeeze out the rubber sap. It takes a lot of effort and is, how do I put this, backbreaking. And the only way that many indigenous African peoples had previously extracted rubber was they would extract the rubber by rubbing it all over their bodies in order to preserve it on the way back. And that caused particularly excruciating pain when it was peeled away. The way that resource extraction was commonly carried out, and I'm pausing here because this is a pretty delicate subject, and I'm trying to think how to approach this with the gravity that it deserves. The most common practice was for Belgian colonial agents and Force Publique operatives to walk into communities and demand that the community members extract a certain amount of kilograms of ivory, and particularly rubber, especially in the latter years of the Congo Free State. And if the people refused to do so, or if they failed to meet the quota given to them by the Force Publique, the Force Publique would either wipe out the entire village, assault the women, or they would hack off people's hands, which is, yeah, that's horrific. Anyways, so the main commodity, however, by the time the year 1900 would have rolled around, would have been rubber. You gotta remember, this is the time period when electricity is starting to become the dominant means of energy. And electricity is spreading all over the Western world. So rubber isn't just the primary material for car tires, it's also what electrical wires are made out of. And so the price of rubber at the beginning of the 20th century was comparatively very high. Now rubber wasn't the most valuable product to come from the Congo. That would have been probably diamonds, or ivory or copper, but there was enough rubber and enough demand for rubber in order to make that the most profitable commodity for Leopold. He was able to finance his colonial endeavor using rubber products. So, the Belgians used the same tactics that that I previously mentioned, where they would demand that the people bring them a certain amount of rubber in order to get them to do that, they would threaten to either kill them, assault their women, or hack off their hands. They also forced the Africans into labor to build particularly their railway system that went from the coast, the town of Kitombe, all the way up the Congo River into what today is the city of Kisangani. And it was the same practices and the same means of forcing people into labor. And some people wonder probably how could the Africans have been forced to commit such atrocities against their own people. Well, there was a system for that too that was also grave. Force publique operatives would often take children, orphans. Many of them were orphaned because the force publique had killed their parents. And they would raise them in a system of boarding schools. In those boarding schools, they would be, how do I put this? I use the word brainwashed, but it's kind of not really landing the way that I wanted to. They would be forced to speak French, and they would also be essentially indoctrinated. That's probably a better word to use. They would be indoctrinated into the Belgian colonial system. So how did the Belgians justify their cruelty to the Africans and their plunder of their resources? Well, again, there's not really an easy way to say this either. Race. They didn't see African people as fully human. And because they weren't seen as fully human, they weren't seen as having any real ownership of their land and resources. And because they didn't have any real ownership of their land or resources, it was theirs for the taking. It was the Belgians for the taking. And this is a particularly difficult photograph I found. Again, it's I'm sure the common practice of hacking off people's hands as a means of forcing them into labor. But the atrocities of the Congo didn't go unnoticed by people outside of both the Congo and Belgium. I'm sorry. In fact, they were very famously noticed by an African-American preacher and journalist by the name of George Washington Williams. He traveled to the Belgian Congo in 1890 with the idea of potentially resettling African Americans there. Leopold II had published this grandiose propaganda campaign of a benevolent rule in the Congo, and so Williams went to investigate with the idea of finding a, how do I say this? Finding a functioning and benevolent system there. But after traveling up the Congo River for 6 months, he left so horrified at what he'd seen that he wrote one of the great pieces of investigative journalism of his time. He wrote a number of articles attacking both Leopold's government and force publique operatives. And very famously enough, in those articles, he coined a phrase that predates the Nuremberg trials by more than 50 years. In an 1891 article, he wrote, "Leopold's Congo state is guilty of crimes against humanity." But many of you probably didn't know that. That term is commonly associated with atrocities committed in Nazi Germany, but it was actually first used to describe atrocities committed in sub-Saharan Africa, which is something that I also didn't know until very recently. It was also the behavior of the Belgians in the Congo was also seen as inspiration for Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. Anybody here read that book? Okay, a fair number of you have read that book. I have not read that book. I'll just be frank with you here. But supposedly the character of Kurtz, who, if you've read that book, you know who that is, was based off of a real-life Force Publique officer, unnamed, who supposedly collected the severed heads of his African victims. So, again, this is also a time period when investigative journalism is very, how do I say this? This is long before the internet, so news doesn't travel as quickly, but it does travel. And in response to this, Leopold was forced to issue a series of public relations maneuvers. Leopold was a lot more of a, how do I say this? He was a master of spin control. He could have taught American tobacco companies maybe a thing or two about PR. In response to what Williams' articles, he spread more and more stories to discredit Williams and also spread news of his benevolent endeavors in Africa. And he also employed the most depressingly effective propaganda technique that is still very commonly used today, whataboutism. Whataboutism. Anybody ever heard of that before? Well, it's pretty simple. We do it a lot. It's the practice of changing the subject towards somebody else's perceived wrongdoings in order to dodge responsibility for your own. Our current president does that a lot. And it's a pretty common and, again, depressingly effective method of dodging blame, especially if you're a public official who people are trying to hold accountable for something. Leopold would spread stories about how the French would rape Algerian women, or the British atrocities against the Boers in South Africa, which was a British colony at the time. And again, it worked, because, like I said, spin control and whataboutism are very effective maneuvers. But it didn't work forever, because one particular person who published more investigative journalism proved to be Leopold's greatest adversary. In the mid-1890s, this man, who was a British shipping executive by the name of Edmund D. Morel, who was based in Antwerp, he worked for a Liverpool-based company, but he had an office in Antwerp, and his enterprise had contracts with the Belgian Congo, noticed something rather peculiar about shipments coming into Antwerp's harbor. Coming in from the Congo were huge amounts of rubber and ivory, minerals, timber, but going back to the Congo were rather curious amounts of weapons and ammunition. How is that possible? Well, he began to investigate more and more through the Congo's contracts, and through this imbalance, he discovered that the extraction of rubber and the extraction of ivory couldn't have been done without slave labor. He and another shipping executive who was Irish by the name of Roger Casement compiled a list of testimonies from some of the Belgian Congo's shipping officials, and they published a series of articles in the mid-1890s condemning the Belgians' treatment of the Africans in the Congo. And in response to this, the British Houses of Parliament then called into the debate the Congo question, and prominent British politicians formally called for the Congo Free State to be abolished and for the protection of its native population in response to Morel's writings in 1905. I want you to think for a second about what I just said. Do you have any idea how terrible you have to be for the British to say, hey, let's cool it a little bit with the imperialism here? I can't believe I just said that to you. And here we are. No amount of PR or spin control could change public opinion this time, and Leopold was forced to rid himself of the problem of the Congo, but he wouldn't give it away. He would sell it to the Belgian Parliament. The terms of the sale were complex, but very simply put, the Belgian Parliament was to assume more than 110 million Belgian francs worth of debt, most of that in the form of bonds, and Leopold himself was to receive a profit to the tune of more than 100 million Belgian francs of his own. His Congo fortune was hidden in a variety of different places, including secret corporations, anonymous foundations, pieces of real estate in Brussels and across Belgium, and properties along the French Riviera. It's estimated that by the time he sold Congo to the Belgian Parliament, he had stolen over $1.4 billion worth of wealth from the Congo. Well, that's not all. After the sale of the Congo to the Belgian Parliament, Leopold ordered that the Congo Free State archives be burned and destroyed. Whatever records the Belgians did keep were gone. And he proceeded to die 3 years later of an intestinal blockage. And it's because these records were built, we don't actually have a clearly defined figure for how many people were killed during the time of the Congo Free State. No one really kept a formal count either, but there wasn't any, there's no way to give a correct number of the number of people that were killed. But it was estimated by a 1921 Belgian colonial commission that over the period of about 4 decades, half the population had been wiped out. So then the question that comes up then is, what is that half? I mean, that is an estimate, right? In 1921, the population of Congo was about 10 million. So that would put the number about 10 million as well. That's pretty harrowing. And there are certain more knowledgeable historians, certainly than I am, that regard Leopold II of Belgium as a mass murderer akin to Hitler or Mao. It was not talked about very much in history classes, and I want you to maybe think for a second about why that might be. So what happened after Leopold II died? Well, from 1906 until Congo's independence in 1960, the territory was referred to as the Belgian Congo. And while the Belgians might not have exercised an identical degree of cruelty as Leopold's force publique had, they continued the system of forced labor, and life for the Congolese was, how do I say this delicately, unpleasant. That's doing a lot of heavy lifting, and that's not appropriate. It was pretty terrible. It was still pretty terrible. I'll just leave it at that. But by the late 1950s, calls for Congo's independence from Belgium grew considerably louder and louder, spearheaded by this man, a trade unionist and Congolese nationalist by the name of Patrice Lumumba. That was his political platform. His goals were, very simply put, a complete decolonization of the Congo and complete independence from Belgium. In 1960, after spending a short stint in prison for some anti-colonialist activities he had participated in 1958, Lumumba flew to Belgium to negotiate independence with the king and the Belgian Parliament of the United Nations. And in May of 1960, Baudouin, I can't remember what number Baudouin he was of Belgium, arrived in Leopoldville to give the Congo its freedom. I don't have a clip of this speech, actually, but there's a newsreel from the time period of the King of Belgium granting the people of Congo independence and giving this speech about how the existence of their nation is the crowning jewel of the works of Leopold II. And can you imagine being a Congolese person listening to the King of Belgium give this patronizing, condescending speech about it's going a million miles an hour here. About the benevolence of a colonial system that slaughtered millions of people. That'd be hard to listen to. I find that hard to listen to. I can't speak for everybody else here. But there was elections later that year in June of 1960, and Lumumba and his political party won a majority of the parliamentary seats. He was promptly sworn in as prime minister. But this didn't exactly sit too well with the Eisenhower administration, because Lumumba was not just a political nationalist, he was an economic nationalist. Part of his political platform was the abolition of not just Congo's status as a political colony, but as an economic colony as well. And he saw forms of neo-colonialism in the Congo as concessions and extraction operations owned by outsiders. But of course, in the Eisenhower years, at the height of the Cold War, this was seen as sympathetic towards communism. So the CIA and the Belgians orchestrated an army uprising in the region of Katanga, which I'm going to show you on the map a little bit later, in late 1960. And in order to resolve that uprising, Lumumba appealed to the USSR for help. That appeal to the USSR was all the justification that the CIA needed to orchestrate Lumumba's assassination. So in January of 1961, Lumumba and his allies flew to Katanga in order to meet with peace operatives, but they were promptly executed by US-backed army operatives loyal to an army officer by the name of Joseph Mobutu. Mobutu himself actually jointly ran the government with another Congolese politician by the name of Joseph Kasavubu until a formal coup in 1965, when Mobutu took full control of the government. Now, Mobutu is remembered in the West as a, how do I say this? He turned out to be a terrible leader, but his first decade in power brought about some pretty big change. Many of you probably remember he hosted the Rumble in the Jungle, arguably the greatest heavyweight boxing match in history between Muhammad Ali and George Foreman. But that's not important right now. Between 1965 and 1975, Mobutu was able to build Congo's economy based off of this huge boom of copper. His regime also built the first hydroelectric dam in the region, which I will remind you is a big deal because the Congo River is very powerful, very fast, and is capable of producing a lot of hydroelectric power. He also changed the name of the country from Congo to Zaire in 1971, and he changed the name of a number of colonial cities as well. Leopoldville was changed to Kinshasa, Stanleyville was changed to Kisangani, Elizabethville was changed to Lubumbashi. And initially, his coup was seen as a positive by many Congolese, but it became clear pretty early on that this was not going to be a peaceful, open government. He then proceeded to destroy the economy by appropriating local businesses and turning them over to his cronies. His government was, how do I put this? Grotesquely corrupt. The underlying source of Mobutu's power was his ability to grant favors to his friends, which some of you might know as clientelism or cronyism. And in order to keep his cronies happy, Mobutu continued to plunder the national treasury and Congo's nationalized resource reserves again and again. He actually stymied development in order to get more foreign aid, which he then used as an alternative source of income. But then, after the end of the Vietnam War, there was this crash of commodity prices, which proceeded to plunge Zaire's government into debt. In response to that, in 1976, the IMF launched its first stabilization plan for Zaire's government, a loan of $47 million, which might not seem like a whole lot to us right now, but in that part of the world at that point in time, that was a lot of money. And in exchange for that loan, Mobutu agreed to cut public spending, devalue the currency, raise taxes, and put the country's financial house in order. But as I'm sure you can probably guess, that did not happen. He continued to plunder the economy without any restraint. By 1990, Zaire's total foreign debt maxed out at $10 billion, which is a lot in that part of the world and for this country. But even as Mobutu drove Zaire's economy into the toilet, there were no serious internal challenges to his rule because opposition was incredibly risky. Critics of the regime faced arrest, exile, torture, even murder, and in the end, it was external forces that drove Mobutu from power. And for that, we are actually going to travel to one of DRC's neighbors, Rwanda. So, the Rwandan genocide of 1994 is familiar to many Americans, often as an example of American impotence in the face of post-Cold War problems, and also because it was truly horrific. But lesser known are the effects that the Rwandan genocide of 1994 had in the disintegration of the Congo. So conflict in Rwanda between Hutu and Tutsi people most likely predates their independence from Belgium in 1962, but the path to genocide began in 1990 when the Tutsi-led Rwandan Patriotic Front, or RPF, which was an insurgency group, began to cross the border into Rwanda from their headquarters in Uganda in an attempt to take over the government. Between 1990 and 1994, almost 20,000 people were killed in that conflict and 1.5 million were displaced. And then, in April of 1994, the plane of Rwanda's Hutu president was shot down, and as a result, the Rwandan army, Hutu-led militias, and Hutu civilians began to slaughter Rwandan Tutsis. In a 3-month span of time, between 800,000 and 1 million people were killed. This did not stop the Rwandan Patriotic Front, however, who proceeded to take over the country in late 1994, which led to more than 2 million Rwandans fleeing, most of them to eastern Zaire. Between 800,000 and 1 million people crowded into refugee camps right here. I don't know if you can see on the map. There's a city called Goma on this lake. I can't remember what that lake's called. Almost 1 million people crowded into refugee camps outside the city of Goma in Zaire. Kagame, who had recently taken over the country of Rwanda, desperately wanted to hold the Hutus living in those camps accountable for crimes against Tutsis. But in order to do that, he would have to invade a sovereign territory. So he helped to set up, and you'll have to quite literally pardon my French here, l'Alliance des Forces Démocratiques pour la Libération. Yes, I did take French in the 4th grade. The AFDL, or if you speak French, AFDL, was actually an insurgent group made up of Zairians who would do the dirty work of hunting down Rwandan Hutus living in Zaire refugee camps for Paul Kagame. And to outside eyes, that would seem like an internal uprising against Mobutu. But the AFDL continued to take more and more territory as they expanded into Congo's major cities throughout the mid-1990s. And in 1997, they proceeded to take the capital city of Kinshasa. In May of 1997, the victorious AFDL leader Laurent Kabila was sworn in as the president of the newly renamed Democratic Republic of Congo. Mobutu fled to Morocco and died there 4 months later. So you'd think that'd be it, right? The fall of a dictator, the rise of a new country that lives up to the democratic in its name. Nope, we're not done yet. Kabila's rapid conquest of Zaire and the ouster of Mobutu is what sometimes is referred to as the First Congo War. The Second Congo War was the revolt against Kabila and the further disintegration of his government. And like a lot of conflicts in this part of the world, this isn't a conflict with just two sides, and it's also not a straightforward us or good versus bad type system. There's a lot of initialisms which can make it difficult to follow, but I'll try and give you the Spark Notes version, as it were. In 1998, Kabila proceeded to expel all of the Rwandans who helped put him into power, which then provoked Rwanda, Uganda, and Burundi, their coalition, to invade the Congo and nearly take Kinshasa in 1999. But Kabila was able to set up an alliance with the militaries of Angola, Zimbabwe, and Namibia to help push the Rwandans back. This military intervention led to the short-lived Lusaka peace accords negotiated in Zambia in 2001, which, as you might be able to guess, did not last. After the disintegration of the Lusaka peace accords, the motivations for fighting changed from politics to profit. Kabila's government supported local militias who fought the Ugandan and Rwandan armies and eventually each other over control of the very resource-rich regions of Kivu and Katanga in eastern Congo. And fighting at that time proved to be one of the only ways to make a living in a failed economy. And it was also truly horrific. Hundreds of thousands of people were killed, millions were displaced. But the turning point came when, in January of 2001, when Laurent Kabila was assassinated by two of his own bodyguards. Diplomats from all of the belligerents met in South Africa to agree on a ceasefire. And the terms of that ceasefire stipulated a 2-year transition period overseen by the largest UN peacekeeping force ever assembled. Unfortunately, that transitional government continued the Congolese pattern of corruption, and in lieu of an effective central government, NGOs and civil societies, including Pentecostal churches and various other religious organizations stepped in to provide some of the services that a government usually provides. And then, on July 30th, 2006, the DRC held elections for president and for parliament. Now, no single candidate won a majority outright, but in a runoff in December of that year, Joseph Kabila, the son of Laurent Kabila, was sworn in as the Congo's first democratically elected leader since 1960. The new DRC government created a new constitution and a new court system and a new system of supposed checks and balances, but Kabila proved to be a leader in his father's ilk. He used violence to silence his main political rivals. He had little control over his own soldiers. The Congolese parliamentarians voted salary increases for themselves, and by 2009, only 4 countries scored lower than the DRC in the United Nations Human Development Index. Today, nearly a third of the population is illiterate, and more than half lack access to clean drinking water. The DRC has actually had a number of other leaders since the ouster of Joseph Kabila in 2019, but it continues to engage in conflict with rebel groups in various regions of the eastern part of their country who fight for control over their resources. What does the future hold? Well, interestingly enough, there's actually a new player in the world of, how do I say this, African geopolitics, China. Now, initially, the first Chinese investors in the DRC were private traders who were willing to gamble on the Wild West aspects of Congolese capitalism, but in 2007, the Congolese government negotiated a deal with the People's Republic of China, where the Chinese would invest $9 billion in Congo's infrastructure in exchange for future revenue from Congolese resources. Now, I don't know about the rest of you, but to me, that looks a little bit like neo-colonialism, huh? Yeah, we'll help build your country if only we can take your stuff. But it's kind of, the relationship is still fledgling. It's a little bit too soon to say how effective that will be in bringing in economic growth and business to the Congo, but I don't know, just something about the idea of giving over your valuable resources to another much more powerful country in exchange for their help, kind of rubbed me the wrong way a little bit. Last year, interestingly enough, Joseph Kabila was actually sentenced to death for war crimes. Supposedly, he was found guilty of collaborating with rebel groups during his time period as president for about 12 years. And its current leader, this president by the name of Felix Tshisekedi, is unfortunately just as authoritarian as his predecessor, and he has negotiated further contracts with the Chinese government as a part of China's Belt and Road Initiative, which that could be a whole separate presentation, but very simply put, it's an effort by the People's Republic of China to invest in ports and bridges and roads in more than 60 countries with the effort to reshape global trade with China at its center. And the Congo and various other African nations are a big part of that because, well, the Chinese need their cobalt and their coltan and their tantalum. And also, now with the advent of AI, in order for the physical infrastructure of artificial intelligence to operate, supercomputers and various other processing centers require more and more amounts of cobalt and coltan and tantalum, most of which comes from Central Africa, specifically the Congo. So what that could mean, we're not really quite sure yet, but what that could mean could be, again, more very powerful nations using Congo as this pawn in a big geopolitical competition, especially as the AI arms race escalates in the next probably 10, 15 years. But it's a little bit too early to tell. In the United States, we tend to have very negative views of Africa, which we also tend to imagine very monolithically. But, and I cannot emphasize this enough, Africa is really big. It's really big, and it's really diverse. Of the 10 fastest growing nations on Earth, 7 are African nations. The DRC is not one of them, probably because of the instability that they've experienced for most of their written history. But their history can tell us quite a bit about why the economic inequities that are commonly seen in post-colonial nations still persist. Thank you very much. I don't have anything to pass this around, so I'm going to rely on all you folks to pass this around for each other. So just a second. Testing. Cool. All right. Would one of you pass this to Anne behind you, please?
So when you showed us the slides of the men holding other people's hands, and that was in the time of Leopold, right?
That's right.
Yeah, so I thought of that, and then I thought about the Rwanda genocide, where we knew that people's arms were being cut off. And I assume that that behavior in Rwanda was learned from here?
Spot on.
Okay.
The Belgians were the first to introduce the barbaric practice of hacking off people's hands to Africans. And to this day, that practice is still commonly used by insurgent groups in sub-Saharan Africa, particularly in the Central African Republic, Uganda, and in Sierra Leone in the 90s.
And what was Rwanda's name in the old days?
It was technically part of the Belgian Congo.
Okay.
They have a different ethnic makeup, so they have their own nationalist movement. Anything else? Lots of hands.
I just holler, how effective do you think China is? Thank you. How effective do you think China is in shaping itself as a real leader in world trade?
Pretty effective, at least in certain parts of the world. They've had a tremendous impact, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa when it comes to building a lot of their infrastructure in port countries, particularly in cities like Dar es Salaam, Maputo, and Mombasa. Of course, ports are not the only initiative that the Belt and Road is designed to account for, but their efforts to reshape global trade, particularly in the global south, I hesitate to use the word term third world because it's a little outdated, have been thus far very successful. Sorry, anybody else? I hope that answers your question.
Yep.
Some other hand right here.
Way over there.
Coming up.
What is our activity there right now in the Congo? What is the U.S. presence? What does it look like?
Well, since Doge cut most of USAID, there hasn't been much of a presence. Previously, we had State Department and I can't remember what the other government agency is, but we had aid. Yeah, we were offering like foreign aid, food and medicine and that sort of thing in the Eastern Congo, where there's a lot of civil conflict. I don't think that's still in place, thanks very much to a certain Elon Musk. But I hope that answers some of your question. Yeah, not a whole lot anymore, and also not as much as there was during the Cold War. But, yeah, I hope that helps. Hands? Anyone else? Yep, should be.
I just wanted to add as a commentary that my father-in-law, who was English and fought in World War I, that after the war got a job with Lever Brothers and ran a palm oil plant in the Belgian Congo. And I can testify that he did not regard the natives as fully human.
It's harrowing.
Yep, that's all.
To me, it's harrowing. And also, that's another thing that I forgot to mention too. The World Wars exacerbated the demand for Congolese resources, particularly of rubber and of what was I going to say? Rubber and during World War II, uranium, because you'll never guess where the uranium for the atomic bomb came from. Anybody else? This is your last chance. And there it went.